The warning Jesus gave. Something strange is happening in the modern world. Lust has become normal. Movies celebrate it. Social media rewards it. Even many churches avoid talking about it. But 2,000 years ago, Jesus said something about lust that shocked everyone listening, a statement so radical that if people truly understood it today, it would completely change how we see desire, relationships, and temptation. And here's the part most people never realize. Jesus did not originally speak Greek when he taught about lust. He spoke Aramaic, and hidden inside the Aramaic language are 3 words that reveal a meaning far deeper than what most English Bibles show. Those 3 words change everything, but before we uncover them, we need to understand something important, because modern culture has redefined lust, and what Jesus meant may not be what people think. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will see the teachings of Jesus about lust in a way that many Christians have never heard before. And the 3rd Aramaic word is the one that reveals the most terrifying truth. The verse everyone quotes. Most people know the famous verse. In Matthew 5:28, Jesus says, "Anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." It's one of the most quoted verses about lust. But something about the translation is incomplete, because the word translated as lust in English comes from Greek, but Jesus didn't say the Greek word. He said something in Aramaic, and when scholars studied the Aramaic meaning behind the statement, they realized Jesus was describing something far more dangerous than simple attraction. He was describing a process that begins in the mind and ends in spiritual destruction. But to understand that process, we need to look at the culture Jesus lived in, because the people listening to him understood his words very differently than modern audiences, and their understanding reveals the first Aramaic word. The culture of Jesus' time. In the ancient world, sexuality wasn't hidden. Roman cities were filled with temples dedicated to fertility gods. Prostitution was common, lust was everywhere. So when Jesus spoke about lust, he wasn't addressing a rare problem. He was confronting something that dominated the culture around him, just like today. But instead of simply condemning behavior, Jesus went deeper. He exposed the root of the problem, the place where sin begins, the human heart. And that brings us to the first Aramaic word, a word Jesus used that most people today have never heard. The first Aramaic word. The first word is ragna. In Aramaic, ragna does not simply mean attraction. It means a craving that begins to take control of the mind. It describes desire that refuses to be satisfied, a hunger that keeps demanding more. And according to many Aramaic scholars, this word was often used to describe obsessive desire that enslaves a person, not just physical attraction, but mental captivity. In other words, Jesus wasn't condemning the moment someone notices beauty. He was warning about desire that begins to dominate the mind. But here's where it becomes more serious, because Jesus didn't stop with ragna. There was a second word hidden in his teaching, and this one reveals why lust becomes so powerful. The second word that few people know. The second Aramaic word connected to Jesus' teaching is leba. Leba means heart. But in Aramaic culture, the heart was not just emotion. The heart was the command center of a person's life. It was where thoughts, intentions, and decisions were formed. So when Jesus said, lust happens in the heart, he meant something deeper. He was saying lust becomes dangerous when it begins controlling the decision-making center of a person's life, when desire stops being a passing thought and becomes a direction. But the most powerful word Jesus used is the third one, and this one reveals why lust can quietly destroy a person's spiritual life. The third Aramaic word, the third word is natsar. Natsa means to guard, watch, or protect something carefully. It was often used in the context of protecting the heart from corruption. So, when Jesus warned about lust entering the heart, he was indirectly telling people something critical. Your heart must be guarded, because once Ragna begins controlling the heart, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. And that is exactly why the book of Proverbs 4:23 says, "Guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Jesus was repeating a warning that had existed for centuries, but he revealed just how serious the problem truly is. And the next part of his teaching is something most people overlook, because Jesus explained how lust actually grows inside the mind, how lust begins. Lust rarely begins with an action. It begins with attention. Something catches your eye. The brain becomes curious. Then the imagination begins to participate. And slowly, a thought becomes a fantasy. Then fantasy becomes desire. And desire becomes action. Jesus was describing this entire chain reaction. But what makes modern lust different from ancient times is something nobody in the first century could have imagined. Technology. Why modern lust is different. For most of history, temptation was limited. A person might encounter it occasionally, but today, temptation is everywhere. Phones, screens, advertisements, algorithms designed to keep people looking. Modern culture has turned lust into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the human brain was never designed to handle constant stimulation like this. But what Jesus said about lust becomes even more powerful when we understand something else. Because he wasn't just warning about morality, he was warning about spiritual blindness. The spiritual effects. Lust doesn't only affect behavior, it changes how people see others. Instead of seeing a person, the mind begins seeing an object, something to consume, something to satisfy desire. And over time, this damages empathy, relationships, and spiritual sensitivity. But Jesus gave a powerful solution, and it begins with something very simple: the power of guarding the mind. Jesus understood the mind is the battlefield. What you repeatedly look at eventually shapes what you desire, and what you desire eventually shapes who you become. That is why he warned people not just about actions, but about thought patterns, because transformation begins in the mind. But there is something even more shocking in Jesus' teaching, because he said there are 3 spiritual consequences that follow uncontrolled lust, and the first one is subtle. The first consequence, desensitization. Something dangerous happens when lust is repeated. At first, the mind feels conviction. There is discomfort. A voice inside whispers, "This isn't right." But if a person continues feeding that desire, something slowly changes. The conscience becomes quieter. What once felt wrong begins to feel normal. Psychologists call this desensitization. The brain adapts, but the Bible described this thousands of years ago. In Ephesians 4:19, Paul wrote about people who had lost all sensitivity. That is exactly what uncontrolled lust does. It numbs the soul, and once a person becomes numb, something even more dangerous begins to happen. Because lust never stays at the same level, it always grows, and that leads us to the second consequence. Why desire escalates. The human brain is wired to seek stimulation. When something feels exciting, the brain releases dopamine. But the brain quickly adapts, which means the same stimulus stops feeling as powerful. So the brain begins searching for something stronger, something new, something more intense. This is why lust rarely stays where it began. It escalates. What once seemed shocking becomes ordinary, and what once seemed impossible begins to feel tempting. Jesus understood this long before modern neuroscience, because when he warned about lust entering the heart, he knew it would begin a cycle of escalation. And once that cycle starts, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. But there is another hidden trap that lust creates, one that destroys relationships. The trap of comparison. Lust changes how the brain views people. Instead of seeing individuals with dignity, worth, and soul, the mind begins measuring and comparing appearance, comparing bodies, comparing fantasy with reality. And real relationships cannot compete with fantasy, because fantasy has no flaws, fantasy has no responsibility, fantasy has no sacrifice. So when the mind becomes trained by lust, real relationships begin to feel disappointing. This is why so many relationships today struggle with trust, intimacy, and connection. But the damage goes even deeper than relationships, because lust also affects something invisible: your spiritual sensitivity. Why lust damages relationships? True love requires something powerful: selflessness, the ability to care for another person beyond physical attraction. But lust trains the mind to focus only on what it can take, not what it can give. And over time, this mindset begins to poison relationships. Trust weakens, communication breaks down, intimacy becomes shallow, and people begin feeling alone even when they are not. But there is something even more dangerous happening behind the scenes, because lust can become addictive. The brain and addiction. Scientists have discovered something disturbing. Lust activates the same reward system in the brain as many drugs, which means the brain begins craving it, not occasionally, but repeatedly. And once a habit is formed, breaking it requires enormous effort. But here is the part most people never realize. Jesus warned about this 2,000 years ago. When he said lust begins in the heart, he was describing the early stage of something that can eventually control a person's life. But the deeper danger is not only addiction. The deeper danger is spiritual numbness. The spiritual numbness problem. When the heart becomes filled with uncontrolled desire, something begins to fade. Spiritual awareness. Prayer feels weaker. Conviction feels quieter. The presence of God feels distant, not because God has moved away, but because the heart has become distracted. In Matthew 5:8, Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Notice something important. He did not say the pure in behavior, he said the pure in heart. Because the heart determines what the soul can perceive, and lust clouds that perception. But there is another warning hidden in Scripture, one that deals with the eyes. Why ancient teachers warned about the eyes. In the ancient world, spiritual teachers often warned about guarding the eyes, because the eyes are the gateway to the mind. What you repeatedly look at becomes what you repeatedly think about, and what you repeatedly think about becomes what you eventually desire. Jesus made a shocking statement in Matthew 6:22. The eye is the lamp of the body. In other words, what enters through your eyes affects your entire spiritual condition. But there is one man in the Bible who understood this principle deeply. His name was Job. Job's covenant with his eyes. Job once made a powerful decision. He said in Job 31:1, "I have made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully." Think about that. A covenant, not a casual promise. A covenant was a sacred commitment. Job understood something many people today overlook. The battle against lust does not begin with behavior. It begins with vision, with what we allow our eyes to consume. But even people who know this truth still struggle. Why? Because the battle is not just physical, it is spiritual. The battle between flesh and spirit. The Bible describes a conflict inside every human being. The battle between flesh and spirit. The flesh seeks immediate pleasure, the spirit seeks eternal purpose. And lust is one of the strongest desires of the flesh, which is why it requires spiritual strength to resist. Paul described this struggle in Galatians 5, but he also revealed the solution: walking in the Spirit. And this is where many people misunderstand the fight against temptation because they think the solution is simply trying harder. But the real solution is something deeper. Transformation. Why lust never satisfies. One of the greatest lies lust tells is simple. Just one more time, just one more look, just one more moment. But satisfaction never comes because lust feeds on imagination, not reality, and imagination has no limits. So the hunger keeps growing, the desire keeps expanding, and the soul becomes more restless. But there is a powerful truth Jesus revealed that can break this cycle, and it begins with renewing the mind. The lie culture teaches modern culture says something dangerous. It says lust is harmless, natural, even healthy. But the teachings of Jesus reveal something different. He never treated lust as harmless. He treated it as a spiritual threat. Not because attraction is evil, but because uncontrolled desire can control the heart. And the heart determines the direction of a person's life. The power of discipline. Freedom from destructive habits does not come from willpower alone. It comes from discipline, the daily decision to choose what strengthens the soul instead of what weakens it. Small decisions create powerful changes over time, and discipline builds something critical: self-control. The role of prayer. Prayer is not just asking God for things. Prayer reshapes the heart. It realigns desires. It reminds the soul of its true purpose. And when a person begins replacing temptation with prayer, the power of temptation slowly weakens. The fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and one final quality, self-control. Self-control is not simply human effort, it is the result of spiritual growth. How temptation actually works. Temptation follows a predictable pattern. First comes suggestion, then curiosity, then imagination, then desire, then action. Breaking temptation early is far easier than breaking it later, which is why Jesus emphasized guarding the heart. Rewiring the mind. The mind can be retrained. New habits create new neural pathways. New thoughts create new desires. And over time, what once felt impossible becomes natural. The power of environment. Environment shapes behavior. What we watch, what we listen to, who we surround ourselves with, all of it influences the mind. Changing the environment often changes the outcome. Avoiding the first step. Many people lose the battle with temptation because they underestimate the first step. They think they can control it later, but wisdom avoids situations where temptation grows. Replacing temptation with purpose. Purpose gives the mind direction. Without purpose, the mind wanders, and wandering minds easily fall into temptation. But when life is filled with meaning, temptation loses much of its power. The story of King David. Even great men in the Bible struggled with lust. King David was called a man after God's own heart, yet one moment of uncontrolled desire changed the course of his life. His story is a warning and a reminder that no one is immune. Small compromises. Major failures rarely happen instantly. They begin with small compromises, a thought ignored, a boundary crossed, a warning dismissed. The power of accountability. No one was meant to fight spiritual battles alone. Accountability creates strength, honesty creates healing, isolation creates weakness. Renewing the mind. Romans 12:2 says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Transformation begins with new thinking. Freedom is possible. Many people believe they are trapped in cycles of temptation, but Scripture repeatedly declares freedom is possible. Change may take time, but it is possible. God's grace failure does not mean the end. Grace means the opportunity to start again, again and again. Why Jesus spoke about the heart. Jesus understood the true battlefield is inside the human heart. Change the heart, and behavior will follow. The power of purity. Purity is not repression. Purity is clarity. It allows the soul to see truth without distortion. The blessing of self-control. Self-control creates freedom. Without it, desire becomes a master. The true purpose of desire. Desire itself is not evil. It was created by God, but it was meant to be guided by love, commitment, and purpose. The restoration of the heart. God specializes in restoration. Broken hearts, broken habits, broken lives, all can be renewed. The three Aramaic words again, ragna, leba, natsar, desire, heart, guard, three words that summarize Jesus' warning, the final warning. What you feed grows, what you starve weakens, the heart becomes whatever it consistently consumes. The choice. Every day, every person faces a choice, feed the flesh or strengthen the spirit. The path of freedom. Freedom begins with awareness, then discipline, then transformation. The message Jesus left. Jesus never taught shame. He taught transformation. Guard the heart, protect the mind, choose what strengthens the soul. Because the direction of the heart determines the direction of a life. And those three Aramaic words still echo through history. A warning, a guide, and a call to live differently.